On January 13, 2013, in the quiet market town of Wisbech, Cambridgeshire, a nephew-in-law arrived at a modest bungalow on Magazine Lane. He was there to collect his aunt for their usual Sunday lunch. When she didn't answer the door, concern quickly turned to horror. Inside, 86-year-old Una Crown lay face down in her hallway, surrounded by a pool of blood and charred newspaper. Her clothing had been set alight. The fire had died before it could spread, leaving behind a scene that should have immediately screamed murder. But it didn't, not to the first officers who arrived. Una Crown was a woman who understood security. As a retired postmistress, she had spent years protecting other people's valuables. She lived alone following her husband Jack's death in 2009. They had no children. Standing just 4 feet 10 inches tall and of slight build, Una was fiercely protective of her privacy and her safety. She rarely had visitors, regularly locked her doors, and never answered unless she knew who was calling. Those who knew her described her as feisty, independent, and not afraid to speak her mind. She occasionally used a walking stick when unsteady on her feet. Every Friday, her niece's husband would take her shopping. Every Sunday, she'd be ready at the door for lunch. She was a creature of habit, a woman who valued routine and safety in equal measure. On Friday, January 11th, she was seen doing her weekly shop. On Saturday evening, at around 5 p.m., she spoke to a friend on the telephone. Those were the last confirmed moments of Una Crown's life before she was brutally murdered in her own home. When police arrived at her bungalow that Sunday afternoon, they made a catastrophic error. Despite the blood, despite the burns, despite the obvious violence of the scene, they concluded Una had died from natural causes. Perhaps a fall, they reasoned. The fire must have been an accident. They didn't preserve the scene. They didn't call for forensic specialists. Critical evidence was washed away, including a key. By the time they realized their mistake, precious time had been lost. It took a post-mortem examination 2 days later to reveal what should have been obvious. Una Crown had been stabbed 4 times. Her throat had been cut. The fire had been deliberately set to destroy evidence. Someone had entered Una's home. Someone had murdered her, and someone had tried to cover their tracks. She had also been robbed of her wedding ring and 40 pounds from her purse. The police launched a murder investigation, but they were already behind. The scene had been compromised. Evidence had been lost. They were chasing shadows in a case that should never have been mishandled from the start. Detectives began piecing together what they could. There was no sign of forced entry, which suggested Una might have known her attacker. But Una was cautious. She wouldn't have let just anyone in. A reconstruction aired on Crime Watch in April 2013. Appeals were made. In June 2014, 2 men were arrested but were released without charge. The case went cold. For years, Una's family waited for answers. Her brother and other close relatives passed away without ever knowing who killed her. The investigation seemed destined to remain unsolved, another tragedy without closure. Another family laughed in limbo. But forensic science was advancing. In October 2022, as part of routine cold case reviews, detectives decided to re-examine the evidence using new DNA testing techniques that hadn't existed in 2013. They focused on nail clippings that had been taken from Una's right hand during the post-mortem examination. These clippings had been carefully preserved, stored away as evidence that might one day prove crucial. The new testing revealed male DNA under Una's fingernails, DNA that was 28,000 times more likely to belong to one man than anyone else. That man was David Newton. David Newton lived just a stone's throw away from Una on Magazine Close. He was a former kitchen installer who knew Una as a neighbor. He claimed he only knew her in passing, that he'd once fixed her back door lock in April or May 2012, but hadn't seen her or been back in her bungalow since. He'd been interviewed in 2013 after a witness saw him drunkenly walking from the direction of Una's home at around 8:30 p.m. on the evening of January 12th. But without concrete evidence, police couldn't charge him. He thought he'd gotten away with murder. The DNA changed everything. Jurors heard when DNA found under fingernails typically wouldn't remain there for longer than 48 hours, especially for someone as clean and fastidious as Una. The DNA had almost certainly been deposited during the attack, as Una fought desperately for her life against her killer. Police investigators ruled out Newton's close male relatives, confirming he was the only person who could have left that DNA. In April 2024, more than 11 years after Una's murder, David Newton was charged. His trial at Cambridge Crown Court lasted 4 weeks. Prosecutors painted a picture of a brutal, senseless attack. Newton had been on state benefits, his only source of regular income. Money was missing from Una's handbag. The day after the murder, Newton was spending freely at Wisbech ex-servicemen's club, playing fruit machines during 2 separate visits. Evidence suggested he'd been drunk on the night of January 12th, pestering elderly women on the telephone. But why he went to Una's house that night, why he did what he did, remained unclear. Newton offered no explanation. He did not give evidence during his trial. No witnesses were called by his defense. He simply denied everything, hoping the jury wouldn't believe the science that had finally caught up with him. After 29 hours and 13 minutes of deliberations over 6 days, the jury returned their verdict: guilty of murder. 10 jurors agreed, 2 dissented. Newton appeared open-mouthed, glancing at the jury as the verdict was read. The jurors, who had carefully examined the complex forensic evidence, were excused from jury service for 10 years due to the difficulty of the case. On February 14, 2025, David Newton, now 70 years old, was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 21 years. The judge told him that Una was 86 when he killed her, a widow living alone, a slight lady who was vigorously independent despite her years. The judge noted that Newton himself had once described her as a very nice, very kind little lady, which made the events of January 12th all the more extraordinary and horrific. Detective Superintendent Ian Moore acknowledged the mistakes made in 2013 and apologized once again to Una's family. But he also commended the investigation that followed, noting it required analyzing over 10,000 items of material, the largest disclosure exercise ever conducted by Cambridgeshire Constabulary. Una's niece Julia spoke for the family at the conclusion of the trial. She described the attack as brutal and horrific, an assault on a defenseless, frail elderly widow who had been watching her favorite television program, feeling warm and safe in her own home. 3 close family members, including Una's brother, had passed away without knowing her killer had been brought to justice. But now finally, they could carry on with their lives knowing justice had been done. David Newton will likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. The case demonstrates that forensic science never stops advancing, that cold cases are never truly closed, and that time does not protect the guilty. For more than a decade, Newton thought he'd gotten away with murder, but he was wrong. Justice for Una Crown came late, but it came nonetheless, brought by the very fingernails she used to fight back against her killer in her final moments. On October 16, 1989, a 22-year-old woman failed to show up for work in Mesa, Arizona. Her employer, concerned about the uncharacteristic absence, contacted the Mesa Police Department to request a welfare check. When officers arrived at her apartment near Country Club Drive and Southern Avenue, they made a devastating discovery. Susan Amy Morse was found lying unresponsive on her bed. She had suffered blunt force trauma to various parts of her body and had been strangled to death with an electrical cord. The brutality of the attack was shocking. This wasn't a crime of opportunity or a burglary gone wrong. This was violent, personal, and vicious. Investigators collected evidence from the scene, including DNA samples, but in 1989, DNA technology was still in its infancy. There were no matches in any database, no clear suspects emerged. The case went cold. Just over a year later, in November 1990, another young woman became a victim in the same apartment complex. The 23-year-old single mother was asleep in her home when an intruder broke in. She was sexually assaulted in a terrifying attack that would haunt her for decades. The perpetrator stole cash and a VCR before fleeing into the night. Like Susan Morse, this victim had fought back. DNA evidence was collected, but again, there were no matches. The case joined Susan's murder in the growing pile of unsolved crimes. For years, these two cases sat in the files of the Mesa Police Department. Detectives would occasionally review the evidence, hoping for a breakthrough, but none came. The victims' families waited for answers that seemed like they would never arrive. The surviving victim from the 1990 assault tried to move forward with her life, carrying the trauma of that night with her, never expecting justice would find its way to her door. Then, in November 2002, forensic scientists made a crucial discovery. DNA samples collected from both crime scenes were found to match each other. The same person had committed both crimes. The killer of Susan Morse and the attacker of the young woman in 1990 were one and the same. But even with this knowledge, investigators still couldn't identify who that person was. The DNA profile sat in the system, waiting for a match that wouldn't come for another 20 years. The cases remained cold through the 2000s and into the 2010s. Technology was advancing rapidly, but without a suspect to compare the DNA to, there was little investigators could do. They needed a break, a connection, something that would give them a name. That break finally came thanks to federal funding under the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative, a program created under President Barack Obama in 2015. This initiative provided resources to address the backlog of untested sexual assault kits and to use advanced DNA testing techniques on cold cases. In the early 2020s, Mesa Police cold case detectives decided to take another look at the Susan Morse murder and the 1990 sexual assault. Using cutting-edge DNA analysis techniques that hadn't existed even a few years ago, they began re-examining the evidence. The new testing was more sensitive, more precise, capable of extracting usable profiles from smaller samples and degraded evidence. And this time, they got a hit. The DNA belonged to Thomas David Cox. Cox was 58 years old when he was identified. He had been living in Colorado Springs, having moved away from Mesa decades earlier. He had gone on with his life, built a new existence, all while Susan Morse remained dead and his other victim carried the scars of his attack. Investigators began digging into Cox's background and discovered something significant. In 1989, Cox's mother had lived right next door to Susan Morse in the same apartment complex. He had been there. He had access. He had opportunity. In April 2022, more than 33 years after Susan Morse was murdered, Thomas David Cox was arrested in Colorado Springs. He was extradited back to Arizona to face justice for crimes he thought he'd gotten away with. The Mesa Police Department worked closely with the FBI and the Maricopa County Attorney's Office to build their case. When Cox was arrested, investigators were able to obtain his fingerprints for comparison. Those fingerprints matched a palm print that had been lifted from the second victim's apartment in 1990. The forensic evidence was overwhelming. Cox faced a total of 16 felony counts across the two cases, including charges of first-degree murder, sexual assault, kidnapping, and burglary. He was held on a $1 million cash-only bond. For the surviving victim, the arrest brought a flood of emotions. She released a statement that captured the weight of 3 decades of waiting. She had never thought this day would come. She thought her case was stored somewhere in a dark basement, forgotten. Thomas Cox had taken so much from her that night and continued to take from her throughout the years. But she had learned how to stop letting him continuously take. She had learned how to stop the pain by not giving it away to him any longer. She had learned how to stop being a victim and start being a survivor. On February 2, 2024, Thomas David Cox pled guilty to 1 count of first-degree premeditated murder and 1 count of aggravated assault. There would be no trial, no forcing the surviving victim to relive her trauma in open court. Cox admitted what he had done. On March 12, 2024, he was sentenced. The judge sentenced Cox to life in prison with the possibility of release after 25 years for the first-degree murder of Susan Morse. He received an additional 10 years for aggravated assault. The sentences would run concurrently. At 61 years old, Cox would be well into his 80s before he could even be considered for parole. Maricopa County Attorney Rachel Mitchell spoke about the case, addressing one of the most agonizing aspects of cold cases, the long uncertainty endured by victims and their families. She noted that Cox had committed these offenses in such a cruel manner and then went on to have a full life while Susan Morse's young life was halted. It was only appropriate, Mitchell said, that Cox spend the rest of his life in prison. The resolution of this case stands as a testament to persistence, to advancing technology, and to the dedication of investigators who refuse to let cold cases remain cold forever. The Sexual Assault Kit Initiative provided the resources necessary to apply modern forensic techniques to evidence that had sat untested or inadequately tested for decades. Without that federal funding, without those advances in DNA analysis, Thomas Cox might never have been identified. He might have lived out his days in Colorado Springs, free, while Susan Morse's family wondered who killed their daughter and sister, and while his other victim wondered if she would ever see justice. Susan Morse was just 22 years old when she died. She had her whole life ahead of her, cut short by a violent predator who lived next door to her through his mother. For 33 years, her killer walked free. For 33 years, her family carried the weight of not knowing. But DNA doesn't lie. Science doesn't forget. And investigators, even decades later, don't give up. The surviving victim's words echo with a powerful truth. She stopped being a victim and became a survivor. She took back what Thomas Cox tried to steal from her, her power, her peace, her life. And now, finally, she has justice too. Thomas David Cox will spend the rest of his life behind bars, a fitting end for a man who violently ended one life and forever altered another. The case reminds us that no matter how much time passes, the truth has a way of emerging. Justice has a way of finding its mark, and those who commit heinous acts can never truly escape what they've done. The evidence waits, technology advances, and eventually, the cold cases that seemed unsolvable become solved.